Good morning, good afternoon to everybody who joined us today. There are several hundred of you with us. We're absolutely delighted you're here. The Macdonald-Laurier Institute webinar on Indigenous Canadians and the New Economy. Delighted to have you with us. I've got three fabulous guest speakers who are going to be telling us their stories and describing sort of their experiences and outlining the challenges and opportunities here. The background here that's really important for you to recognize is that Indigenous entrepreneurship is one of the most remarkable stories going on in this country. Indigenous entrepreneurs are expanding their activities in hundreds of different businesses, thousands of businesses in many, many, many sectors. We organized this seminar because we wanted to draw attention to something that really gets ignored. The assumption is that Indigenous people are sort of locked out of the new economy. They're not participating in the high tech, the artificial intelligence, the digitization, robotics sort of work that's going on. The purpose of the webinar today is to put that notion to rest, to make it clear that our entrepreneurs are already working in this field, and to talk about the challenges because they're not inconsiderable and the opportunities that actually lie before us. We're joined here today with three remarkable sort of guests. Cherish Clark is the president and founder of Digital Engine Technology. She's coming to us from the Taku, overlooking the Taku River in beautiful northern British Columbia. Cherish, great to have you with us. We also have Jake Dockstetter. Jake
Hi, sorry, Ken, I can't hear you. Hi, Ken, sorry, I can see you speaking, but I can't
Ken, Jacqueline is suggesting that you leave and rejoin. I know that you can't see the chat.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh my, insane. Sorry, folks. So we got James back. James is there. So I'm just going to jump back in and hope everybody is still with us. My apologies to everybody. Ironic that we're doing a session on the new economy and technology has let us down. So unavoidable, it happens from time to time. So please accept my apologies for that this challenge. I started off by introducing our speakers. So I'll do it again. Cherish Clark, Digital Engine, who's joining us here from the shores of the wonderful Taku River in northern British Columbia. Jake Dockstader, Executive Director of the Sioux Lookout Friendship Accord Economic Development Corporation, calling in today from Winnipeg. James Delorme, who is the CEO of Indigenous Inc. Incorporated, calling in from the gorgeous west coast of British Columbia. So, folks, my great apologies to all of you for the problems we just had. I'm really sorry for that. But we're going to ask you to start off by introducing your approach to this concept. Indigenous people to the new economy is not something that immediately jumps to mind when most people think of the Indigenous entrepreneurship and Indigenous development. General focuses on resources and that sort of thing. So I'm going to ask you each to give an opening sort of comment on how you see Indigenous people working in this really important economic space. And Cherish, I'm going to go to you first.
Hello, good morning, or good afternoon, depending on where you're dialing in from. I'm here on the traditional territory of the Taku River Tlingit First Nation, down on the Taku River. I'm here for Salmon Resiliency Camp, and I'm grateful to technology to give me the opportunity to work remotely. That's one of the highlights of being an entrepreneur, is that you get to set your own pace, and often you're working twice as hard for half as much. But to have the skill set to participate in the new economy is something that I continually have gratitude for. And so I live and work in Whitehorse, Yukon. And as I mentioned, I'm from the Taku River Tlingit First Nation in Atlin, British Columbia. I have my Bachelor of Science in Computer Information Systems that I obtained in 2007, and I started my business, Digital Engine Technology, in 2020, just prior to COVID. So there are a lot of Indigenous people that are working in the new economy and working in technology, and I'm really grateful to be here today with Jake and with James. So thank you, Ganesh Chichati Adi, Shitikti Uai Hat Yanyadisha Hasati.
Thanks so much, Cherish. A wonderful introduction. Jake, to you.
Thanks again, and great to be here along with my colleagues Cherish and James. The Friendship Accord is really a unique organization. I didn't take the same risks that James and Cherish did starting my own business, but it's run by 4 communities in Northern Ontario, communities of Lac Seul, Slate Falls, Cat Lake, and Kitchener-Meku-Sibininuag, or KI. Those 4 communities together created this sort of working group with the municipality of Sioux Lookout to jointly work together on issues of sustainability, housing development, medical care, whatever the issue of the day is. And I saw it as a very unique organization. So when they wanted to transition it into a more active organization in the region, I was thankfully selected as the inaugural executive director. So it's been an incredible couple of years working with these 4 communities and the municipality. When it comes to the new economy, this new structure with a sort of a jointly led economic development corporation that focuses on sort of outside of the communities, looking at sort of urban centers such as Sioux Lookout, Dryden, Kenora, even as far as Toronto, we have initiatives planned. So I think that definitely people have their eyes set beyond just their region, and that's part of the new economy that we're building right now. So thank you.
Thanks, Jake. It's an interesting part of the world. There's a lot of demand for minerals and forest products and things in that area, but it's fascinating to see those communities uniting and working on sort of a new approach and new patterns as they develop. James Delorme, welcome.
Thank you, Ken, Cherish, and Jake. Good to be here. Imot sam squagan, hochu happy, nishta skeja. Coming to you today from the traditional territories of the Lheidli T'enneh, which what they call Prince George. So James Delorme, member of Klahoose First Nation, but I should qualify that statement. My original roots come from Treaty 4. Cowessess First Nation is where my dad's from. My Mushum is from Cowessess, and my Kukum's from Kagawistahau in near Broadview, Saskatchewan. The other side of the family, they're settlers, so Scottish and Icelandic. So I kind of refer to myself as a Viking Indigenous guy, and it always gets a lot of jokes and a lot of laughs. So Klahoose is on the coast. The work that I did prior to was I was a chief of Klahoose. So leadership is part of my family. It's part of, I grew up in it, and, part of my dad's culture and the way he grew up. So, but we've always been entrepreneurs. A lot of my relatives have either served in the military or they've been part of some kind of government involvement. So a lot of my relatives are involved in politics or in business. And so it's just a natural fit for me. So early on, I adopted technology back in the 90s, the advent of the internet and all the emerging technologies back then. I really adopted as part of my own. And I started to see some very interesting trends that were starting to take place. And that was there was a digital divide that was happening with the Klahoose community. And we were doing IMIT sort of data management type projects, but we didn't understand what it was. And so what we started to see in the governance sense was that we were missing out because we didn't really have that capacity in our communities to understand how that data is actually going to impact us in the future. So long story short, I became chief of Klahoose First Nation. I transferred to Klahoose, and so it's a little bit of a story of innovation. But I was chief there for about 6 years. Really enjoyed that, being a part of the community. But when you talk about the new economy, we've been a part of the new economy in our traditional economies. So what that means is that we've always been there with supply chain, with having the ability to do business with other communities. And so really, when you talk about the new economy, you're really talking about the Indigenous lens. You're talking about our participation, what we've proven, how we do things in a traditional sense, being on the land like Cherish is, to also progressive modern technologies and how we're participating in various different business opportunities. So Ken, I'm just so glad to be here, part of this conversation, and so be glad to be here with my colleagues here and everything that the experience that they bring. Thank you.
That's wonderful. Thanks, James. It's very kind of you. I should also mention really quickly to those people listening in that if questions arise as you go along, you can just enter it in the chat. And if we have time, we'll get to them. I have some questions for the panelists myself, but we will try to integrate the questions we've received. And we received about 10 or 15 from people before these webinar even started, which is always a good sign of your deep engagement. Cherish, I'm going to ask you a question that might find it a bit awkward to put you on the spot, but one of the things that I always find fascinating when you talk about Indigenous entrepreneurs working in digital technology and artificial intelligence, working in robotics, people are still surprised to hear an Indigenous person is involved in a high-tech company. And you must hear this in Whitehurst a lot. You're one of the leading sort of innovators in the whole community, not in the Indigenous community, but all of Whitehurst. Sort of, why are people still surprised? And what do you see to them when they express that surprise?
I think there are still a lot of statistics and social inequalities across Canada and for Indigenous people around the world. So we have to really encourage more Indigenous students to pursue STEM. And anyone has the ability to pursue higher education. And I'm a big advocate for people really pursuing their careers and taking a lifelong learning standpoint. So IT is primarily a male-dominated field, but where I live in the Yukon, First Nations people comprise at least 25% of the total population. So I think that I might know more Indigenous people in tech within the far north than elsewhere.
Oh, I see our technological challenges continue. I'm sure Cherish will be back with us. Oh, go ahead, Cherish. You just disappeared for a minute.
Yeah, I bet you Starlink was switching satellites. I was just saying that I might know more Indigenous people in tech in the far north, and that I try to hire women, BIPOC, LGBTQ, Two-Spirited Plus people, and mentor more young Indigenous people within the industry, a knowledge transfer of my formal education and what I've learned in the field to try and support more Indigenous people in tech. It's also predicted that we will experience more technological progress in the coming decade than we did in the preceding 100 years put together. And so we're seeing great advancements happening in process automation and virtualization, with almost half of all work activities could be automated within the next few decades. So it's really my hope that more Indigenous people across Canada will take the opportunities we have now to advance their careers and pursue a higher level of education within the technology industry. I also wouldn't say that people are surprised to see an Indigenous person working in IT, but I have encountered situations where there's almost a suspicion about my credibility and an assumption that I got some sort of special privilege, be it financial or otherwise, to arrive at the place that I'm at today. I also think that there can be a higher level of expectation or even lateral violence from Indigenous communities, regardless of the industry. And it can be very difficult for new Indigenous entrepreneurs because as Indigenous people, we strive to make our communities and our ancestors proud of the work that we do and the impacts that we leave behind 7 generations into the future. Many people who leave community are also coming back to give back to their communities and to contribute to the health and well-being of their nations. And I would also say that Indigenous people across the world controlled and still have a large influence within their traditional homelands and trade routes. As mentioned, I'm currently in the far Pacific Northwest within the Tongass National Forest, which is the homelands of the Tlingit Nation. And we controlled the trade route between the Russians, the Chinese, the Europeans, etc., between the coast and the interior. One of my great aunts spoke English, Tlingit, Southern Shoshone, and Russian. So I would say that Indigenous people have always been entrepreneurial in nature, and that the world is just waking up to that fact.
I love it. I love it. That's interesting. And in fact, I love the connections back to the early history, the fur trade connections. And entrepreneurship is not a new phenomenon. I mean, James was saying the same thing. Indigenous people have been entrepreneurial all along, and they're just applying it in new areas. So, Jake, to put a question to you, one of the fascinating sort of developments of the last 30 years has been watching Indigenous people who are blocked. We underestimate how many of official blockades there were that stopped Indigenous people from participating economically. There are all sorts of legal injunctions, and living on reserves caused problems and that sort of thing. And Indigenous folks work really hard to sort of become part of the natural economy and the national economy in this country. Now a new economy has come along. Digitization, artificial intelligence, robotics, all these other process engineering things that Cherish and James were talking about. So Jake, what's standing in the way? What's standing in the way of Indigenous communities that are trying to break in? Your communities in Northwest Ontario are small, they're isolated. What's stopping them from participating in a major way?
Right. So, I mean, great question. It's a difficult topic to go over quickly, but I'll do my best. I think that first you need to look at the legislative regime that sort of surrounds First Nation communities and First Nations individuals. Looking at pieces of legislature like the Indian Act, for example. These pieces of legislation have made it incredibly difficult for traditional capital or private capital to get involved on reserve. So, for example, it's impossible to take security from a banking perspective on reserve. So if you had, for example, the idea to start a restaurant or a cafe, you would be unable to mortgage your house to get the startup capital from the bank in order to pursue that sort of thing. So you're very limited in the avenues that you can pursue for private funding. And that's the same for communities as well. They're very much restricted to ministerial guarantees for housing when it comes to building on reserve. It's not really possible for new businesses to invest in, for example, call centers or office space. It's all being done at the band level because the second you build something on reserve, you really don't own it anymore. It's part of the band or the federal government, and it's not something that you can ever really leverage or utilize further. So that's been, I think, a very difficult situation to unravel. I mean, obviously, when it was put in place, it was done so to prevent sort of the private sale of the land base of the reserve. But now today, it's preventing growth and opportunity from coming on reserve. So that's certainly one thing. There are, of course, federal initiatives to address this through Indigenous Services Canada or Crown Indigenous Northern Affairs Canada, but they are often quite oversubscribed. In the last 2 years, I've had a number of conversations with those departments on how exactly the French Accord can get involved. Of course, I mean, core funding is getting your overhead paid for by the federal government is kind of the dream. So they've let us know that they prefer existing recipients over new ones. So new organizations aren't really able to break in. And of course, again, they are oversubscribed, meaning that there's really no money left at the end of the year. So where we've had a lot of success is looking not at sort of getting our rent paid for, but what can we add to the region? So a lot of our initiatives currently focus on skill development and training. So we're working with the province and the Ministry of Labor, Training, Immigration, and Skill Development to bring tuition-free and barrier-free education to Sioux Lookout, focusing on in-demand industries such as AZ, DZ driver, or various industries as it relates to the mine and the mineral development industry. So that's where we've had a lot of our success with our applications, is not on trying to get things paid for, but looking at what services we can provide, and what programs are currently out there and are needed in the region.
It's so interesting, Jake, what you're saying here, because, and it matches up with what Cherish was talking about. You're saying there's Indigenous entrepreneurs trying to get new businesses going. There's federal programs. There's not enough money. In other words, there's a roadblock right there. Lots of people banging on the door, not being allowed in. And Cherish, we've talked about this before, that there's lots of young Indigenous people that want to go on to a university or college. They're really keen to go, but the funding isn't there. Remember back many years ago when Brian Mulroney was Prime Minister, he gave a speech in Victoria one time where he said, I promise that if young Aboriginal people want to go to university, we'll make sure they're able to go. And then they were flooded with people who wanted to go. So the aspiration, the drive, the entrepreneurship is there. And then all of a sudden these barriers sort of emerge that just sort of stand as a roadblock in their way. So James, you've spent your career knocking down barriers and climbing over them. Tell us a little bit about your company, about what you actually do in the kind, and I know I shouldn't say your company, your companies, your different kinds of entrepreneurial activities. But tell us a little bit about those. And if you wouldn't mind, about how you sort of broke past those barriers, particularly in terms of financing, which is a major, major issue.
Thanks, Ken. And yeah, wow. Where do I start? I mean, it's a lifetime discussion because, Jake said risk, he mentioned, and it's a huge risk personally that I've had to go through. So I have this company, called Indigilink, and we do all kinds of research. We also advise, organizations, digital organizations. We do a lot of work with partners. Relationships are huge, for the work I do. I can't do all this work by myself, so I rely on other folks that help me support the work. But breaking through into this space, obviously, my leadership abilities and entrepreneurial spirit, it's almost taken me down, quite honestly, Ken. This work as an entrepreneur, to being that leader, risk taker. It does take a lot of energy and time, and it's mountains and valleys you go through. And so anybody that's listening today, and anybody that's actually in the entrepreneurial spirit or working in the field or doing the work especially as an Indigenous entrepreneur, we have so many challenges for us. We could go into detail what those barriers are, but for me specifically, to actually get that capital, that startup capital, was really tough. There's just so many barriers for us as startup companies to get that funding, and so I had to be really creative. I had to use my relationships. I had to use my friends. I had to use situations that you have to grind to get into that position where you're at a level where you can get that revenue stream going and you're okay, meaning you can pay the bills, you can pay the rent, you can make sure that your family's taken care of. A lot of times we look at the the digital space and the you linked on social media profiles, and you go, well, this is a wonderful life, but it's a lot of hard work. It's really tough. But the lessons I learned along the way could never replace. And I'm happy here. I'm happier because, as Cherish mentions, I get to do things that I want to do, and I get to enrich the lives of the people around me. So I saw a question, in the chat there from some folks about connectivity, digital connectivity, and that's really in my wheelhouse. It's what I do. I see that as a foundational piece for our participation. And so a lot of the work that I've done in the past is around connectivity, because one thing that I've realized, and Cherish, I know hopefully I'm not stealing your thunder, Cherish, but that is a key component to us being a part of that new economy. I work with all kinds of industries with all kinds of great technologies, and I won't go into those technologies because they'll bend your mind. But what I'll say is that none of these really great technologies we're looking at, AI specifically, and also with decentralized models, you can't do it without the internet. Without a robust internet that's coming to your house, you cannot use these tools. They do not work. And so all the wonderful things that in an urban setting that you have that supply the ability to have automation and IoT, it just doesn't happen in the north. It doesn't happen in remote locations because we don't have that robust connectivity. And I don't want to show sides of different telcos, but the telcos really have to take some time to understand what those connectivity issues are in communities, and we're getting there. I've worked with the province of BC. I see what's going on with the work on the coast, the Connected Coast project. So connectivity is huge, and that's what I do. My company, I help them, advise them, help give them some advice, and because those telcos really need to understand, our role as Indigenous people, having that technology, that connectivity, that's actually going to drive our economy. And if we don't have that in our learning centers, we don't have, people in the community that are taking that leadership role by understanding IT, I am IT, and being that community champion, that digital divide is just going to keep growing. So one of the things that I've been asked to do, which I'm really proud of, is been asked to work on the TELUS Indigenous Advisory Council. And I'm so glad that I get a chance to bring my voice to that level, because I've been doing this work forever, and we got to keep the conversation going. So thanks, Ken. And it's an ongoing battle as an entrepreneur, just to keep it going. But I'm here, and I'm going to keep going.
and thanks for your determination. But also, James, just to bring this home, during the pandemic, across Indigenous communities across this country, not all of them, but most of them, the failure of the internet was catastrophic. There were many, many, many communities that did not have access. Cherish, I think Starlink is relatively new to the far north, to Yukon and northern British Columbia. Hasn't been around for a long time. But during the pandemic, there were communities that were cut off, and everybody else in the country shifting to online education. These kids sat at home. They did not have the access to the internet, and the consequences are massive. Cherish, these are the kids that we want to come to university and college 10 years down the line. They lost 2 years of education, and it's really, really hard to get that back. So there's a price to pay for not doing what you talked about, James. So Cherish, you work in the digital space. And I know you're very much aware of the much broader sort of range of things that are going on in terms of high technology and those kinds of things. Where are the most promising areas for Indigenous entrepreneurs and Indigenous communities? So I'll ask you to focus on the entrepreneur side. I'll come back to Jake and ask about the community side. But what specific things should people be looking for? Should they be all over artificial intelligence? Should they be looking at the Internet of Things? Should they be interested in robotics? What's your best guess on where the opportunities lie?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to go back to the connectivity afterwards, just because I am playing a huge role within that space as well. But for youth today who are looking to get involved in technology, I think we should all be asking ourselves, first of all, how we can give back to our communities versus what our communities can give to us. Many people ask what they can get versus what they can give back to their community. So what I would say that what drives the new economy is competition, innovation, and productivity growth. And there's 5 big industries right now. Internet of Things, so like robotics, 3D printing, automation. There's connectivity with 5G, broadband, network availability, and capability. We're also looking at cloud technologies, so data and processing in hybrid or multi-cloud platforms. We're seeing a rise of data centers and centralized data. We also have big data and AI. And the interesting thing is, out of all of those 5 industries, you could pick any one of them, start learning today, and never get to the end of your learning journey because things are always evolving. So people should also be looking at a post-secondary education, specifically in technology, because it will give you a really good foundation that you can start to build your skill set on.
It's exciting and sort of intimidating at the same time, Cherish, because the speed of change is so fast and the evolution of society is going along at such a ferocious pace. And then some of these things just are scary. Artificial intelligence, we've got hundreds of experts around the world begging governments to regulate artificial intelligence. And at the same time, we've got thousands and thousands of companies who are trying to move rapidly into that space. And some of them have done extremely, extremely well. Jake, let's turn that question around a little bit. You work in Northwest Ontario. You work with a series of communities. Several of those communities have really been cut off from the economy for a very long time, struggling to find an economic feet. How do you convince the people in those communities that innovation, the commercialization of technology is part of their future? You're organizing a big workshop conference in Toronto later on this 2023. How do you convince those communities that going to Toronto to talk about innovation was part of their future?
Right. So I think that there's definitely an understanding and almost urgent feeling not to be left behind among First Nation communities. They definitely see that things are moving, but the issues of the day, whether it's housing on reserve, healthcare, access to food, access to energy, these things sort of take immediate priority. So there's definitely the consideration there's limited capacity to deal with issues on reserve. One thing I'll speak about as well is the election cycle. Typically, unless they opt out of it, is a 2-year election cycle. So you have turnover at the leadership level very, very often, which makes things difficult to make meaningful change at the policy level. So once you have, they can get out of that, but again, it's a process they need to go through. But there is definitely understanding and a need to participate in this new economy, and you see that with initiatives like Connect North. So Connect North is essentially resource centers that you see in Northern Ontario and I believe elsewhere in Canada as well, where they have high-speed internet and access to distance learning. My experience with the communities I work with is that these have not really been, although they do exist, they're not being really utilized fully by the community. So there needs to be a push as well. I think that, a big issue is that these connections aren't being made. There's no easy entry point to work with these remote communities. Even trying to get, for me to work with the chiefs up there, it's difficult for me to get a hold of them. So if you're just coming into the space and you don't know them, it can be almost impossible. So one of the things that we're doing is we're hosting this conference in Toronto, December 5 and 6, called the Technology and Indigenous Development Summit. And what we're trying to do is build those connections and those relationships between the tech community and Indigenous governance and leadership, so that there's a bit of a relationship being developed, that we can start to see these connections being made and potentially see more participation from private industry in First Nations development, and making sure that this digital divide doesn't continue to grow at the rate that it is. Outside of that, the French Accord has another initiative that we're working on called the Regional Indigenous Engagement Strategy. And this is really to work more closely with the resource development, but any sort of infrastructure that's going into the region has to go through an Indigenous engagement process to essentially work with the communities, accommodate and consult with them about the changes in the money that's going into the region, the changes that are going to be that are going to be as a result of that, whether it's investment in mineral development or even things like the Wate transmission line, which is bringing on-grid power, so you can get out diesel generators. But there is always that engagement process. And again, there's no easy entry point for that. So it's really a consultant-driven business, and we're trying to change that model a bit and make it an Indigenous-led initiative with the Friendship Accord and help codify a bit more what that engagement looks like. But yes, so I mean, there's a lot being done, but the main thing is for private industry, the connections and the relationship being developed, and we're trying to facilitate that with our conference this winter.
That sounds like an exciting event, Jake, for sure, to have bringing people together to sort of focus on these kinds of issues. But the way you describe it, and all three of you are basically saying the same thing, is that you've got a huge effort has to be made to catch up educationally, in terms of technology, in terms of connectivity. You've all talked about the digital divide and the fact that remote communities are sort of locked up. And at exactly the same time that you're catching up, the rest of the world is going ahead even faster. The thing that always terrifies me about what's going on right now, if you look at the federal government's targets for high-speed internet for all of Canada, their targets are laughable. Their goal is by 2030 to have less connectivity than I currently have on a remote island in British Columbia, because I can use Starlink, right? The goals are not ambitious enough, and so First Nations are going to be left lagging behind yet again. The Métis Indigenous communities, even as you catch up, it's like running a 100-yard race where every time you go 10 yards, they move the finish line 20 yards, right? It just keeps moving and rolling as you go along. The opposite side of this, though, we've seen some really good examples of this in Asia, is where both countries and communities have said the technology allows us to jump over different stages of development. If we get it right, we can jump much farther ahead. So James, the question to you is about the education system in Indigenous communities. We've had a lot of conversation about Indigenous education over the years. We know that the high school graduation rates are not great. The participation rates in universities and colleges are not great, often because there's not enough money for people from less well-to-do families to actually even go to post-secondary education. So based on your role as a chief, but also as an entrepreneur, is the education system doing enough to get young people ready for the new economy?
Ken, really, really great, really brilliant question, quite honestly. And I'm really passionate about that specific, thought and idea, because we're losing out on current opportunities to be in the tech sector. And Cherish really at the beginning really talked passionately about having a lot of different groups involved, within the tech sector. And I really like that perspective of that where's all the Indigenous tech folks? Well, they're in the North. And so it's true, it's in our communities where we're actually doing it. But also we really got to, I think I have to take that perspective of how do we actually excel that? How do we excel those folks that are in the community on the land, and make sure that they're actually developers, or they're in the sector, they're working in the sector, because the jobs are unbelievably there's a huge volume of positions that need to be filled with people with qualifications, and our education system really isn't adaptable to help with that. So I do have to give the province of BC a little bit of credit, because they have done some innovative ideas by adopting micro certification. And some folks have really kind of poo-pooed the idea of micro certification. But the thing that I see as a value is that you can actually be a digital marketer, within 8 to 10 weeks. You have the skills to get into the sector early on. You may not have the complete knowledge base that you need that, traditional education has, but it gets you in. It helps you get faster in the industry. And to me, that's important, because when somebody comes to me and says, James, I really need a digital marketer for a project that we're doing, and they say, we really want an Indigenous person to do that. And I know a lot of people that are in that industry, but I do have struggles trying to find that specific Indigenous developer, or even a coder that has that experience in the back end, so for very complex projects. but even at the simple level of designing very simple websites, really have struggled. I struggle. So this is the thing. We have to get into the industry faster. Our education system has to adapt to better systems that highlight at an early stage. So what I mean by that is kindergarten understanding AI models. I know that scares people. It's like, what do you are you trying to get our kids into AI? They need to understand the concepts so that when they do finally get into, say, high school or get into that dual credit program, and they're looking at a STEM program, as Cherish mentioned, then they're better prepared. So we have to start today. We have to change the mindset of education. We have to start a new path forward, and it involves us, being that chairperson to make it happen. So thanks for that.
Yeah. Love the passion and enthusiasm, James. I think you're right on. Cherish, I know you want to talk about connectivity, and you always, this is your, not just your bread and butter. This is your passion in life. You watch communities being connected up, so separated for so long. So if you had $100 million to spend, and you could only choose one area, would you put the money into connectivity? Would you put it into advanced education? Or would you put it into entrepreneurial support? If you wanted to help Indigenous communities make sure they had a chance to participate fully in the new economy, connectivity, education, or entrepreneurial support?
I personally would put it into education first. It's this mantra of if you teach a man to fish. So yeah, I would definitely put it into education. And I don't know all the programs across the country, but I know that in British Columbia, I'd like to say that I feel like we're very cutting edge in the level of programming that we're providing. So I like to think of myself as where, because there was another question as well about from the chat, if there are Indigenous cultural barriers to entrepreneurship.
Yep.
And I like to think of myself as the place where technology and culture intersect, because there's a lot of pressure right now on a notion of two ways of seeing within science and traditional Western science and traditional knowledge coming together. And so we've had lots of people from universities and whatnot come through the Yukon and through the North and interview elders and gather knowledge about traditional ways of being, stories. Within my culture, our stories and our songs are wealth. And it's all sort of a spectrum of the digital divide. It's more than just broadband. It's also looking at archives. So personally, I've digitized over 3,000 records of elders and trying to unlock those knowledge-based systems by putting them into databases and just grabbing like an analog signal, like a cassette tape or a VHS, and digitizing it into MP4, MP3. So there's a whole process, when it comes to technology, there's a lot of work that needs to be completed. And specifically in BC, we have something called the BC First Nations Technology Council that helps a lot with the with education and sort of like micro certifications, and it's a good way for First Nations people in BC to get their foot in the door. There's also an organization called First Voices, and they're making different dictionaries for First Nations communities across British Columbia, just ensuring that people have access to the language. So, within high technology, I think there's a real cultural aspect and ways that we can unlock traditional knowledge to teach new Indigenous people coming forward about their language and about their identity and the knowledge of their elders. So I just wanted to mention that there's like a formal education, and then there's also a way that we can utilize technology to learn more about our cultural ways of being and knowing.
And there's such exciting work there, Cherish. And Cherish is one of the key participants and leaders of one of the most impressive cultural dance groups and musical groups in Northwest Canada. So I know you live this yourself, in the digital space, but also in the traditional culture. And many people, myself included, think that the salvation of traditional language, knowledge, and information is actually going to rest with digital technologies. if we can figure out how to do it properly, and then get the right kind of support. So let me put Jake a little bit on the spot. And one of our people wrote in, Steve wrote in and asked about what institutions and agencies are providing funds for First Nations. He was specifically asking about equity in large energy projects, and I know you've got one of those involved in Northwest Ontario, the transmission line, which is going to radically change life in Northwest Ontario. Can you tell us about that project and about how it was funded, and how the First Nations, who is not just the Sioux Lookout First Nations, is the whole consortium of there who got that off the ground. So tell us about that major innovation, which is also a catch-up initiative, as you well know.
Yeah, of course. So, I mean, when we're talking about who's providing capital to these projects, it really depends. I mean, I could look at the Henry Inlet Power Project as an example as well. But when it comes to Wate, there's an equity portion owned by the First Nation, and I believe that was sort of a set aside as part of the consultation and accommodation portion of that. So the equity really was almost like wasn't guaranteed, wasn't a set aside, but the purchase was backed by the contracts that were already in place with the provincial government. And that's something that you'll see quite common when it comes to these larger transactions, is that banks aren't really willing to deal with First Nations until there's someone else or something else backstopping it. Yeah. So when it comes to housing, it's the ministerial guarantees you see with CMHC. When it comes to these energy developments, it's the offtake agreements with the province or the partnerships they have with large energy companies that sort of backstop it. Traditional capital is very, I don't want to say shy, but cautious. And First Nations don't typically hit all the metrics that they want when it comes to lending. We don't fit into a nice box. So there needs to be additional considerations and criteria, which often means the money is more expensive for the First Nation if they're trying to borrow it. So yeah, when it comes to who's providing capital, it is the banks, but only when they are very comfortable.
Yes, and you're talking about communities that are small, have relatively small economies. You're lucky if they have a big mine in the backyard or a big forest operation that gives you more foundation. But boys, it becomes a terrible loop, doesn't it? Where you have to be Absolutely. Economically successful to be economically successful, which is quite fascinating. So James, just to sort of push beyond that question a little bit, I think many of the people watching today and many of the people who follow this field will be really interesting questions about how non-Indigenous people can participate and help in these sort of new economy initiatives. Most of them, like the ones that Cherish are describing, are culture-based and very local. They're actually trying to preserve a particular language of a particular society. But there's lots of folks out there who are really keen to participate. How can non-Indigenous people really perform as allies in this kind of an enterprise?
Yeah, allyship. There, you said it right there, Kent. I also wanted to mention the work that Jake's organization is doing is really important for folks to really understand what that is, and because it's a huge resource. It's a huge resource, not just for the communities that he's working with and the communities that he represents, but it's also for the public to understand, because this is happening all over the place. I take some of my friends at the First Nations Major Projects Coalition and that model that they use about community first. And so when they're working with communities, it has to be about the communities and less about the industry. So people need to understand that you do have a place as an ally. You do have a way to work with communities, and it takes understanding that Indigenous lens. So there's large organizations that have support, like Jake mentioned, and then also FNMPC and other folks that are working with major projects. I know that Cherish is doing some pretty amazing things in the north with connectivity, but also we have to get in that granular community level, and what that means is we have to start looking at our own biases. I have to look at biases of mine, which would be I'm better than somebody else by coming into a community. I know more, that privilege of Mr. DeLorme thinks he knows more about technology and thinks that he can fix the community. That is an old style of thinking that it doesn't work anymore. We need to understand that that knowledge base is in the community and is already there. and that we have to come respectfully and talk to communities in a way that's not harming them further than they've already been harmed. Meaning residential schools, meaning 60 scoop. There's a whole mirrored discussion there that's affecting our communities. My dad attended residential school, and it affected me greatly. So these are things that people need to understand, that, look at James, he's wonderful, he's a great guy, but also I've got my own biases, and I have the things that I have to address, from my growing up. And nothing's perfect, but if you're at the table, if you're at the front seat and you're saying, I want to help, I want to be a good ally, that's the first step. And then start learning about what the Indigenous lens is, and you will see that your relationships will start to grow, and you actually participate in a better way.
So we actually have 5 minutes left to go, and I think we actually still have even despite my technological faux pas at the beginning, I'm not sure what went wrong. We probably should stop at the bottom of the hour to make sure our system continues to work, because I think we've only scheduled that time. But I'm going to give you each sort of a minute to wrap up and your sort of final comments. And Cherish, I'll start with you, then to Jake, and then to James. So taking us all away, Cherish, you're involved in a Field of Dreams idea. You're bringing in the technology into your community, and you honestly believe this is going to change that community in a major and positive way. So tell us how exciting the new economy is for Indigenous communities.
Yeah, so I have 1 minute left. I just wanted to thank everyone who participated today. There were so many things that we didn't even get a chance to talk about. Right now, I'm working on we talked about the digital divide, and in my community, we didn't even have DSL, right? We're on a satellite microwave uplink is what I refer to it as. And I was able to present to the CRTC a few months ago, and it was thanks to my non-Indigenous allies, that I was able to get to that table and have lawyers and a team of consultants help me do the presentation to change the ILEC, the incumbent local exchange carrier, from TELUS to Northwest Tel, because the fiber was over 1,200 kilometers away from my community. We're very, very remote. So connectivity is number one. The CRTC has a 5010 uplink standard that they want to hit. There is a broadband connectivity gold rush happening right now across Canada and also in the United States. Something in addition to the Indian Act that's holding back First Nations communities is also the Jay Treaty. So the Jay Treaty was signed in 1794. But in 1956, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that it was never affirmed by Canada's Parliament, even though it was ratified by Great Britain when Canada was still a colony. So we need to look at expanding ourselves, not just within our borders within Canada, but internationally. And how can we do that with legislation such as the Jay Treaty? So yeah, I'm working on a major broadband infrastructure project. I'm bringing cell phone service to my community next year in 2024, and we really need the right tools. The thing is that technology is also expensive. You need to be willing to make the investments. The more and the quieter I am, the better I'm doing my job. I'm so grateful to be a managed service provider. I'm grateful for my education and for my clients. It's been a lot of word of mouth and people that know my work ethic. I often find that I'm overworked. I need more capacity. I'm always looking for somebody to come and support me in the work that I do. So I'm grateful to everyone that tuned in to the live broadcast, and thank you very much. Ganesh Chishatya Adi.
Thanks, Sharon. It's wonderful. We're grateful for you too. I can tell you that for sure. Jake, to you.
So thank you very much for having me as a panelist here. Cherish and James, thank you so much for sharing the stage with me. The work that you're doing is incredibly impressive and vital for the communities. Just on my end, when it comes to First Nations, we're always trying to build relationships. We're trying to build new inroads into new areas, new sectors, and technology has been, one of the most exciting, I think. So thank you all for joining us here today. I think that if you're interested in more of these types of conversations, we are hosting a conference again in December 5-6, called the Technology and Indigenous Development Summit. We'll be addressing issues of housing, energy, training, skill development, and of course, logistics, which is a huge issue in the North. So anyway, hope to see you there. And again, thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks, Jake. Appreciate that very, very much, and best of luck with your great conference idea. James.
Got to keep it simple, Ken. Thank you to my fellow panelists, and for you, Ken. Brilliance. This is lovely, wonderful experience, and thanks for having me on and listening to my voice. And it's important we support small business. It's important we support Indigenous entrepreneurs. Thank you for taking the time. We say Chetam Kwaname. Thank you. Oh.
So to everybody, the audience members who stayed with us, that's fantastic. To the three of you, always tremendously impressed with all of you, and we see the future flashing in front of our eyes when the three of you talk. I mean, and it's a good future. It can be better, and I think we have to work really hard to make sure it's the best it can possibly be. This is the first of our seminars on Indigenous people in the new economy. I can guarantee you it won't be the last. We had many questions coming up in our chats and asked before we didn't get a chance to get to them all. There's the questions about the further north. What happens for the Inuit, where the internet is even a more distant dream than it is in Atlan, right? You've got huge problems and huge challenges, but also so many technology we didn't talk about. We didn't talk about 3D printed housing and 3D printed manufacturing, and didn't talk about the future of retail and the kind of new economy as it's emerging. There are so many possibilities that sort of could reconstitute Northern life, reconstitute the life on Indigenous communities, break away the barriers of remoteness and isolation. But you need Indigenous peoples to be empowered. The three of you are among the most powerful people I've ever met. I wish you all the very best with your entrepreneurial activities and with all the things you're doing. And I hope you know you have my endless support and that of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. So thank you, everybody. Thank you all for joining us today. I should just wrap up by on behalf of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, thank you and Jocelyn and Jaya for their wonderful work of making this all possible. I should also tell you that Macdonald-Laurier Institute is a registered charity. This is a tiny plug asking you to donate if you wish, to actually keep our operations going and to make sure we can have more of these kinds of discussions. The kind of audience we had today was fantastic. The audience participation was over the top, and these three brilliant speakers, we're going to have you back again. So thank you all very much, and thank you for joining us today.